Let me emphasize that we do not prosecute by public pressure or by petition. We prosecute based on the facts of any given case, as well as the laws of the state of Florida.
Welcome back to Hardball. That was, of course, the special prosecutor, Angela Corey, earlier tonight in that big news that she's prosecuting for second-degree murder. There certainly was a lot of public pressure, however, surrounding this case, and a lot of it certainly had a lot of influence on what's been happening. Over the past few weeks, we've seen protests in cities around the country. We're looking at the signs with people calling for Zimmerman's arrest, openly saying, arrest this guy. Did those protests play a role in pushing the case forward? Obviously. If Trayvon Martin never became a national headline, would, well, anybody really who's listening right now think we wouldn't have gotten as far as we did to the charges filed against him, Mr. Zimmerman, tonight? Jonathan Capehart, MSNBC contributor, a very smart friend of mine, and an opinion writer for the Washington Post, who I read somewhat religiously, and Michael Smerconish, who has a real good ear for people out there as a syndicated radio host. I want you both, and also an MSNBC contributor, in order, Jonathan and then Michael, I want you to look at the fact that we've gone to a turning point tonight, a plot point, you might say, in the movie industry, where now the man has been prosecuted. He's being prosecuted. He has a defense attorney. It looks like it's going to be an interesting case. Will the media be able to stand back and observe the presumption of innocence? We haven't had a national criminal case like this since the O.J. case. But in this case, it's in the environment of this media jukebox, of a pinball machine, rather, I should say, where the ball bounces around with opinion after opinion after opinion, some facts along the way. Can we cover this case fairly in the media?
I would hope so. And I think, you know, quite frankly, I think we've done a pretty good job of just presenting the questions that led to a lot of the protests. How is it possible that a man could shoot an unarmed teenager who just had iced tea and a bag of Skittles and not be in jail, to at least be held accountable in a court of law? And I think you're right. Tonight is a pivot point, because everything that Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, Trayvon's parents, have been asking for has been an arrest. And now they've put their whole faith in the justice system, which is, I think, where it should be. And as long as we in the media, and particularly folks at home who are going to be watching this case religiously, keep in mind the facts of the case and how the law works, I think everything will be okay. But it's incumbent upon us in the media to not get whipped up and involved in sort of the theatrics and the hysterics going on outside the courtroom, and just focus on the facts. Because I think the facts are there for all. I think the facts are there, plain and clear for everyone to understand. It's just a matter of whether they will meet up with the law that would allow for the justice that I think a lot of people think George Zimmerman should meet.
Well, let's see that. Michael, my question is, there's a lot of facts still out there we're going to have to get to and try, if we can get there, because we know that he pursued him. We know that George Zimmerman pursued him. It's all on tape. We all heard that together many, many times. We know that he ended up shooting the guy. We know that. What happened in those minutes in between, we don't really know. Let me ask you this. How do you cover it on the radio? How do you cover it on television when people are so heated up about this thing?
Well, I've tried to cover it in as straightforward a manner as possible by clearly delineating that which is fact and that which is scuttlebutt.
Yeah.
You know, one of the observations that I have, Chris, that's distressing is how many people, at least judging by callers, are anxious to come to a conclusion that suits some sort of political objective. You know, they think they've got it all figured out, whether they're on the side of Trayvon Martin's memory and charging George Zimmerman, or in believing that George Zimmerman was in the right on this. And time and again, I find myself saying, we don't know. And we shouldn't be rooting for any side. We should be rooting only for all the facts coming forth. One other observation, if I might, this Angela Corey impresses me as not bending to public whims for this reason. Very easily, and this really is a hardball assessment, she could have used a grand jury. She could have used a grand jury and then given herself distance and said, well, the grand jury voted to indict George Zimmerman, or the grand jury decided not to make an indictment. She didn't do that. She said, I don't need it in this case. Here's what I think. We're moving forward.
What happens, Jonathan? This is always tricky if the law doesn't conform to our notion of justice. Suppose there is, in fact, and we know there is, a stand-your-ground law in Florida, which allows for this preliminary hearing.
Right.
We heard about it tonight from David Weinstein in quite good detail, where a judge can have a preliminary hearing and simply decide on behalf of the defendant and say, you're right, you were standing your ground, you were defending your life out on a sidewalk somewhere, you thought your life was in jeopardy, or about grievous permanent bodily injury was being threatened against you, and you took action. question. What happens to all this media rigmarole and all the noise and heat level right now if a judge does that?
Well, Chris, that will be the next pivot point, and focusing in on that as you have, I think is very instructive, and I think people should pay attention to it, because stand your ground is the law of the land of Florida, and it could be the escape hatch, if you will, for George Zimmerman. As long as people understand that and know that, then they can pivot for whatever outrage they might have if indeed George Zimmerman is successful in using that as a way of escaping prosecution or a full-on trial.
Escape hatch, which was a loaded phrase right there. You know, for years, the conservatives blasted the court system for letting people off on what they called technicalities. Right. You know, and now you have something called the Stand Your Ground law, which is a technicality, and the left will say, or the black community, perhaps if you want to generalize, will say, what a stinking law this is. This guy gets off when something should have never been in the law books. Fair enough,
you know what?
But it's a question of moral justice against the actual laws on the books.
Right, and then if that indeed does happen, then as I was going to say, the anger at that result would, I think, necessarily have to turn to finding ways to change that stand your ground law in ways that doesn't make it possible for someone to escape prosecution just by saying, I plead self-defense because I was afraid that that my life was in danger, even though I'm the one with the gun and the other person only has a bag of Skittles.
Michael Smerconish, back to you on the same question. We may be back to a situation within months, certainly within a year, where a judge will have to rule on stand your ground, and there will be a verdict by that judge, not by a jury.
I think it's going to really revolve around whose voice is making the plea for help on that other 911 call, because you've heard already that two opinions have been rendered and suggest that it is not the voice of George Zimmerman. I spoke to Alan Dershowitz about this earlier today, and he reminded me that they won't be able to conclusively say it is Trayvon Martin, but they'll be able to rule out Zimmerman. And Chris, the reason that I think that's significant is because we're trying to find out what or who provoked this. And if you've got Trayvon Martin making a plea for help at the end of that 911 tape, then you wouldn't think he was the one who had provoked this. You would think that Zimmerman provoked it.
Yes,
it'll be very hard for him to protect himself in the stand your ground law. It's just not designed for he who is the provocateur in a case like this.
Jonathan, my friend, let me ask you about this question, and maybe you and I are all victim to this. We all come from the experience we've lived, whether it's a white person or a black person, African American or not, and this is in our DNA almost. How do we get from what we have to look at is the whole history of a lack of justice for black Americans in this country, going back to the first slave to arrive here, all the way through Jim Crow, all the way through the last time a person was abused by a police officer, to the actual data of this case? How do you separate community justice, we were taught by the Jesuits, from distributive justice? There's a lot of distributive injustice in our society. People are just unjustly treated. But how do we get to the actual justice of this case, separated and divorced from our larger attitudes and histories?
Right. Well, that's what I've tried to do. And, after my initial piece, just talking about, what it's like to be an African-American man and living with the burden of other people's suspicions about me. And after having written that, I then focused in on the facts of this case as we knew them, as they came trickling out. And I think as long as people focus on the facts of this case, they will find their way. We will all find our way to whatever the truth is as we can ascertain it at this point. But I do think in the piece that I just wrote, my faith in the justice system was really suffering as a result of this case.
Jonathan?
But now, as a result of Angela Corey, it's been restored.
Okay, great comments as always, sir. Thank you, Jonathan Capehart of the Washington Post. And from here, Michael Smerconish of Michael Smerconish. And from here, great comments by both of you. That's Hardball for now. Thanks for being with us. The Ed Show with Ed Schultz starts right now.